A quiet morning in Graham, Pennsylvania. The sun rises, casting soft light over the peaceful town. Suddenly, gunshots echo through the air. In a cozy home, a man collapses to the floor, gasping for breath, blood pooling around him. In the bedroom, a woman, Beverly, rushes out, confusion and terror on her face. She freezes at the sight of a gunman in the living room. Silence hangs for a moment, then more shots ring out. The sun rises higher, illuminating a still house. The neighborhood remains quiet. No signs of a break-in, nothing stolen. Two bodies lie side by side, covered with a blanket, as if someone wanted to hide the horror. Detectives gather at the police station, reviewing the case. They exchange glances, knowing they're about to uncover a disturbing story that will shock the town. A warm spring evening in 2001, two college students, Brian and Beverly, meet at a party. Their eyes lock, and an undeniable connection sparks. They share laughter, stories, and a dance. Their bond deepens over the summer as they introduce each other to their families. Beverly, an energetic athlete, excels in sports and has a gift for music. Brian is drawn to extreme sports, always seeking the next challenge. After graduating, they focus on building a future together, saving to buy their own home. On May 15, 2006, they exchange vows in a breathtaking seaside ceremony. Their honeymoon is an adventure, taking them to several countries before they return home to start the next chapter of their lives. They settle in Graham, purchasing a beautiful house near a river and a dense forest. It is the ideal place to lay down roots. Brian continues his work as an engineer, and Beverly shifts her focus to translation work while pursuing further studies. They quickly become part of the local community. The morning is still. Brian's friend, Stephen, arrives for a fishing trip. He knocks on the door, but no one answers. He assumes his friend has overslept. He knocks again, louder this time, but the silence makes him uneasy. Frustrated but not alarmed, he decides to go fishing alone. As the day passes with no word from Brian or Beverly, Stephen's unease grows. That evening, he returns to their house, knocking once more. The silence is unsettling. He circles the property, peering through the windows, but the house is dark. When he reaches the garage, he notices that Brian and Beverly's car is parked inside. That makes no sense. Walking to the living room window, he presses his face to the glass, straining to see inside. The dim light makes visibility difficult, but something on the floor catches his attention. The television is overturned, and next to it lies a large, unmoving shape. Stephen's pulse quickens. He rushes to his car, grabs his flashlight, and directs the beam through the window. What he sees makes his blood run cold. Lying motionless on the floor are two bodies, partially covered by a blood-soaked blanket. Panic surges through him as he fumbles for his phone and dials 911. His voice shakes as he reports what he has seen, urging authorities to come immediately. He remains outside, waiting, unable to tear his eyes away from the tragic scene. Officers arrive, and Stephen is the first person they question. He explains everything: the planned fishing trip, the unanswered calls, and the horrifying discovery. He can't shake the feeling of regret, wishing he had checked the windows earlier. Inside, the scene is grim. The front door isn't locked, nor does it show signs of forced entry. In the living room, Brian and Beverly's lifeless bodies are found just as Stephen had seen them. Preliminary findings suggest they had been dead for at least 12 hours. Each had sustained 3 gunshot wounds from a large caliber weapon. The precision of the shots indicates that the attacker was deliberate. But why? There is no evidence of a robbery. Nothing is missing. Their wallets, phones, and cash remain untouched. There are no signs of a struggle, no indication that anyone had tried to fight back. It is as if whoever had done this had come with one goal in mind: execution. One disturbing detail stands out. The bodies had been moved after the murders. Blood smeared across the floor reveals drag marks, and the perpetrator had made a clumsy attempt at cleaning up. Smudged streaks of blood mar the walls and furniture. Despite the effort to erase evidence, forensic specialists can still follow the trail. 6 spent shell casings lie at the scene, carelessly abandoned. The evidence suggests that a single assailant fired every shot. The lack of forced entry raises another troubling question. The door had been unlocked, suggesting that Brian and Beverly had willingly allowed their killer inside. Investigators theorize that Brian had answered a knock at the door and recognized the visitor. Perhaps he had turned to lead them into the house when, without warning, 3 bullets struck him in the back. The sound must have drawn Beverly from the bedroom. She likely froze in horror at the sight of her husband's lifeless body and the armed intruder standing over him. She ran, but didn't make it far. 3 bullets struck her from behind, cutting her down in the hallway. Her body was later dragged to the living room, placed beside Brian's. One perplexing detail remains. The killer had covered the bodies with a blanket. Was it an act of remorse, an attempt to conceal the brutality of the crime? The floor is smeared with blood, as if someone had tried to clean it, but only made the mess worse. Behind the couch, officers discover a plastic broom with dried blood clinging to its bristles. The handle had been wiped clean of fingerprints. This suggests the killer had used it to sweep away bloody footprints, but had taken care to erase any trace of their identity. Smudged handprints and palm prints dot the walls, too distorted to yield a clear match. Despite the killer's effort to obscure their presence, forensic experts know one thing. The longer someone stays at a crime scene, the greater the likelihood of leaving behind an incriminating clue. Then they find it. On the blanket covering Brian and Beverly's bodies, there is a faint but crucial detail: a boot print. The pattern is distinctive. Forensic analysis determines that it comes from a rare model of heavy-duty work boots. Investigators trace the boots to a construction company in Clearfield County that had recently purchased several pairs. Another potential breakthrough comes when detectives find a palm print on one of the house surfaces. It is carefully analyzed and run through law enforcement databases. No match. The perpetrator has no criminal record, making identification difficult. Naturally, the first person under suspicion is Stephen, the friend who discovered the bodies. He had visited the house twice that day and had been the one to alert authorities. When detectives question him, Stephen is visibly shaken. He explains that he had assumed Brian and Beverly were still asleep when they hadn't answered the door that morning. Once he realizes he is being treated as a suspect, Stephen is shocked. He claims he had spent the entire day fishing at a secluded spot by the river, but since no one had been there with him, he has no alibi. Investigators review footage from traffic cameras along the roads leading to and from the fishing area. The recordings confirm Stephen's timeline. Further forensic testing clears him. His fingerprints don't match any found at the scene, and tests for gunshot residue come back negative. With no physical evidence tying him to the crime, Stephen is officially ruled out. Hoping for another lead, detectives canvass the neighborhood. When they knock on the door of Daniel and Jennifer Tavares, who live across the street, they finally get something useful. Daniel recalls that on the morning of the murders, around 5:30 a.m., he heard loud noises coming from the couple's home. Curious but wary, Daniel glances out the window and notices a white pickup truck parked near Brian and Beverly's house. He is sure the vehicle doesn't belong to them. Moments later, he sees 2 men exit the house. Despite this promising lead, no one else in the neighborhood has seen the truck or its occupants. During an interview with detectives, Beverly's mother recalls a troubling conversation she had with her daughter just months before the tragedy. Beverly had mentioned a neighbor, Jeremy Flint, who had made her feel uneasy. Jeremy, a 22-year-old man, has a reputation that has already drawn law enforcement's attention. He is known for dealing illegal substances. Given his history, investigators consider him a person of interest. When officers go to Jeremy's home, they find it empty. Their immediate thought is that he has fled after committing the crime. However, speaking with local residents reveals another potential motive. Shortly before the murders, Brian and Beverly had hosted a small gathering at their house. Jeremy, uninvited and heavily intoxicated, had barged in. Witnesses recall his erratic behavior, harassing guests and stirring up conflict. After a heated exchange, he is forced to leave, but before storming off, he makes a chilling threat. The couple would regret humiliating him. The next morning, Brian and Beverly discover that several items are missing from their home, including a cell phone and a handgun. Convinced Jeremy is behind the theft, they confront him at his house. Though they remain calm, they make it clear that if their belongings aren't returned, they will report him to the authorities. Jeremy denies taking anything. The following day, the missing belongings mysteriously reappear in the couple's backyard. While the situation seems resolved, Beverly can't shake her unease. She begins to fear being home alone. Jeremy finally resurfaces several days after the murders. Detectives bring him in for questioning, but their suspicions quickly begin to fade. As it turns out, Jeremy has been out of town when the crime takes place. His alibi is airtight, confirmed by multiple witnesses, which places him miles away on the night of the murders. Further forensic analysis seals his innocence. His fingerprints don't match any found at the scene. With no evidence tying him to the crime, Jeremy is eliminated as a suspect. With their strongest lead gone, investigators find themselves back at square one. Desperate for a breakthrough, they revisit Daniel Tavares. Daniel had initially reported seeing a suspicious white pickup truck near Brian and Beverly's home. But when detectives speak to him again, his story has changed. Suddenly, Daniel claims he can now recall details about what the perpetrators were wearing. This contradicts his original statement. His shifting story raises a chilling possibility. Had Daniel been lying all along? A deeper look into Daniel's background reveals a disturbing history. Born into a strict military family, Daniel's early years are marked by hardship. By the time Daniel reaches 9th grade, his life has spiraled out of control. He drops out of school, becomes involved in petty theft, and is arrested for robbery at 18. His estranged father intervenes, helping him avoid jail time, but Daniel squanders it. Over the years, he continues his descent into crime. In July 1991, a heated argument with his mother escalates into something unimaginable. In a sudden attack, Daniel grabs a knife and stabs her nearly 30 times. He is sentenced to 20 years in prison. Despite being sentenced to 20 years, Daniel is released on parole in 2006. A mix of bureaucratic failures allows him to slip through the system unnoticed. A clerical error results in his fingerprints being erased from law enforcement databases. Further digging reveals another troubling detail. Daniel had briefly worked for the construction company that had purchased the rare work boots linked to the murder. Despite this, detectives lacked direct evidence to arrest him. Detectives invite Daniel to the police station under the pretense of helping create composite sketches of potential suspects. Eager to cooperate, he agrees. Moments later, another officer mentions a key discovery: the bloody handprint found inside the Mock's home. Daniel tenses, nervously explaining that he has visited the Mock home in the past. The officer reassures him that there is no reason to worry. After all, the handprint is in blood. At that moment, a second detective steers the conversation toward Daniel's past. When asked, Daniel admits to killing his mother, but what happens next stuns investigators. Instead of expressing remorse, Daniel recounts the murder in chilling detail, showing an eerie detachment. While he rambles, forensic analysts complete their work. The bloody handprint from the crime scene is an exact match to Daniel Tavares. Detectives confront him with the evidence. His smugness vanishes. Before he can react, officers restrain him and place him under arrest. Faced with undeniable proof, Daniel admits to what happened that morning. The previous night, he had spent hours at a bar drinking heavily. By the time he had run out of money, he was belligerent. Furious and humiliated, Daniel fixated on an absurd thought. Brian owed him money. A month earlier, Daniel had given Brian a tattoo as a favor, but now, in his intoxicated state, he convinced himself that Brian had taken advantage of him. At 5 a.m., still seething, Daniel grabbed his revolver and walked over to the Mock's house. When Brian answered the door, he was groggy. Daniel immediately demanded payment for the tattoo. Confused, Brian refused, telling Daniel to come back when he was sober. Enraged, Daniel pulled out his gun and shot Brian 3 times in the back. The gunfire woke Beverly, who rushed out of the bedroom to find her husband lying motionless. She froze, locking eyes with Daniel. Realizing the danger, she turned to flee, but only made it a few steps before 3 bullets struck her from behind. Once the horrific act was done, Daniel panicked. He ran home, waking his wife Jennifer. Without hesitation, she agreed to help him cover up the crime. Together, they returned to the Mock's house. Jennifer helped move Beverly's body into the living room, placing her beside Brian. She then grabbed a blanket and covered them both. She was also the one who suggested using a broom to erase the bloody footprints. When the cleanup was done, Daniel disposed of the murder weapon, throwing it into a nearby river. Despite extensive searches, the gun is never recovered. With his confession and forensic evidence stacked against him, Daniel has no hope of freedom. He is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jennifer, claiming she only helped out of fear, cooperates fully with investigators. She is sentenced to 1 year in prison for tampering with evidence. The case seems closed, but Daniel Tarvis's dark history is far from over. Years later, in 2015, the past resurfaces in a horrifying way. New homeowners purchase the house where Daniel had once lived with his mother. During renovations, they begin digging up the backyard and unearth human remains. Forensic analysis confirms what detectives had feared. The bones belonged to a young woman who had gone missing in 1990. As investigators piece the story together, a disturbing truth emerges. Daniel had known the woman. She had been a neighbor. Rather than risk getting caught, he had buried her in his mother's backyard, where her body remained hidden for decades. The new evidence leads to Daniel receiving a second life sentence. It is now clear that Daniel Tarvis had always been a predator, lurking in the shadows, and for years he had managed to escape justice. Until at last the truth caught up with him.